I hope there's going to be a small presentation. Um, no, I'm getting more and more nervous. Okay, I am immensely honored to be here addressing this audience. I also have to say that I think it's pretty close to a scandal that I've been asked. If the International Monetary Fund has to sink to asking journalists the answers to important economic questions, I tend to think the world is lost. The There were very few subjects, I think. No, that's actually not true. But there were a limited number of subjects on which Friedman and Keynes agreed completely. And one of them was that the best currency arrangement is a floating exchange rate. I have believed that these distinguished gentlemen were right for pretty well 40 years. And so that's my starting prior. I think it's important to say this. And I am, however, not going to address that issue in the context of everything that has happened in the world over the last few years and what we should learn from this. I'm going to focus on something which I learnt, which I didn't know. Perhaps I should have known, but I didn't know, at least to the extent that I do now, I think. And so, quite contrary to and this has turned out to be very convenient, quite contrary to the previous speaker, I'm going to focus on one relatively narrow issue. But it has very big significance, I think. And the issue is very clear from the title, namely the history of Spain and the UK. And those who are familiar with this literature will know that I am really delivering the paper that Paul de Grauwe would have delivered if you'd invited him, or maybe you did invite him and he said he had better things to do. But I will do it with a twist, because I've also been asked a lot of questions, and one of them I'm going to answer in a way that surely Paul would never answer it. I'm going to address essentially two questions. What have we learned about exchange rate regimes from common currency areas to hard pegs to manage float, basically about common currency areas? And I'm going to answer another question with some footnotes around this, which was the euro a bad idea, to which my answer is, of course. Now, I am going to start, if I may, just to say that I have form on this subject, with what I thought about this 22 years ago, when I was involved in a debate at the FT on this subject, and I wrote the sentence that you've seen there, that I was very concerned that the efforts to bind states together, it was after all a political project, remember this, it is supposed to cement European solidarity, may lead instead to a huge increase in frictions among them, and if so, the event would meet the classical definition of tragedy: hubris, arrogance, arti, folly, nemesis, destruction. You can guess from that what I started my life studying. Now, that seems to me a pretty good description of the sort of situation we're now moving to, because in fact, far from cementing goodwill among the European peoples, cementing a sense of deep solidarity among them, the Eurozone has been dragged kicking and screaming to great integration. This is perfectly correct, as Jay has said, but it has, without the slightest doubt, enormously exacerbated ill will. Anybody who seriously studies the newspapers and talks to people will understand this. So what I have learnt in the last 5 years, and it's the crucial point here, is that being inside a currency union makes it enormously more difficult for a country to handle a financial crisis. And to put it another way, being a monetary area is even more valuable than I thought it would be when things really go wrong. Or as I put it another way, 95% of the time, having an exchange rate is an unspeakable nuisance, and the other 5% really matter. This defect was, in my view, necessary, not contingent, so it's not clear to me, though I'm going to comment on this, that there is some other arrangement of the constellation in the Eurozone which would have avoided these problems, other than a move to a full federal union, and I'll come to that in the end. And from this I conclude, since I don't believe a full federal union is going to happen, that the euro was indeed an exceptionally bad idea. Um, I don't know why that's happened. Okay. So let's look at Spain and the UK. They're both seriously crisis-hit countries. Post-crisis, both have dreadful fiscal positions, and they have very big problems, though they are different problems. Every country manages, all unhappy countries manage to be unhappy in their own way, of course. But they are not the same. They're not the same problems, but they are very big problems. But they have also been trying to manage this crisis with fundamentally different positions, just staggeringly different positions in terms of their long-term debt, interest rates, that is to say their public debt rates, and of course that has inevitably transmitted itself to the whole private sector credit structure. This has given the Spanish government much less room for manoeuvre than the British government. It's all permanently on the edge of crisis. It has been in much poorer shape to ameliorate the conditions of the economy, which are, in many respects, absolutely catastrophic, with a GDP fall cumulatively of 8% of GDP and unemployment rates somewhere between 25 and 30%. I'm not going to insist on those particular levels, but they're unquestionably catastrophic. So what explains those interest rate conditions, which affect the entire economy, as I said, because of the very close links between governments and banks, which I admit tend to be greater in Southern Europe, in the UK, but they exist, of course, in the UK as well. That's the central issue I want to address. So let's start with what has happened. Here I've put three countries, Germany, Spain and the UK, and what's happened to their 10-year government bond yields since the crisis hit. And from this you would of course look and conclude that the UK is a country with absolutely solid external and fiscal positions, from which there was no crisis whatsoever, and is enjoying basically the lowest long-term interest rates in its entire history. Congratulations to the UK, you're obviously doing very well. Meanwhile, Spain had a very big spike at the beginning of the crisis. They shot up at the peak to 7.5%. They have gone down to 5% as a result of the policies, I think, of the central bank. But it is important to remember, given that Spain is a country which effectively is going to have to deflate to get back into competitiveness, the real rates implied by 5% in interest rates are probably in the neighborhood of 5 or 6%, and they are likely to remain at 5 or 6% for a very long time, and the chances that the economy will grow anything close to that rate are very small, so the debt dynamics are absolutely appalling, even if you allow for the deficit problem. Now, obviously, one hypothesis might be that this is because Spain has a much worse fiscal position than the UK. I think this is about as good a convincing argument as you can possibly get, that this is not the case. Both Spain and Italy entered in the crisis with what looked very comfortable fiscal debt positions. I've already pointed out before that the net debt position for the UK was probably the best, close to the best. There are one or two other periods, but close to the very best for the last 250 years, and Spain's was even better. Spain's was even better. For those, by the way, who are surprised by this, the average net fiscal debt relative to the GDP of the UK over the last 300 years was about 110%. People may be a bit surprised by that, which is why I find the Reinhardt-Rogoff conclusions absurd, because if it were true, the Industrial Revolution could never have happened. But that's another matter altogether and has nothing to do with this at all. But the point is, Spain had a superb fiscal performance going into the crisis. Net debt fell consistently. Fiscal policy looked incredibly good. And then, of course, the crisis hit, and they both ended up more or less in exactly the same path for fiscal debt. And the IMF tells us, or told us at least in the last database, WEO database, that they were going to end up at about 90% of GDP in 2017, and the IMF is never wrong, so this must be true. So the question obviously is, Why should two countries, not dissimilar in size, with much the same fiscal position, viz. Disastrous, with an immense increase in fiscal debt, have government debt rates which are so massively, colossally different, i.e. the UK rates are like Germany's, and Spain's are, well, like Italy's. So this is really a big question, and I must say I was surprised by this outcome. Now, I've put forward 5 different hypotheses, and I won't have the time to go through them all. The first is essentially liquidity risk. It's the one that Paul de Grauwe has emphasized. Namely, there isn't a dedicated central bank dedicated to making sure that the market for public debt is liquid in all circumstances. This generates the risk of multiple equilibria in crises, and that's essentially what's happened to Spain. I'd just remind you, by the way, in that context, since Mervyn King is here, that the Bank of England was not created to manage monetary policy or anything of that kind. It was created to manage public debt in order that Britain should fight one of its innumerable wars, which is why they ended up with so much public debt. The second, that was William of Orange's contribution to our financial history. The second risk is, of course, credit risk, but that because there is no central bank able to do this, there is a genuine possibility that relatively suddenly you might find yourself in a default position, and that's pretty well inconceivable in the UK, and it's an important risk. The third risk is, of course, breakup risk, the possibility of a chaotic return to a national currency, which might be accompanied with exchange controls, sudden depreciation, and all sorts of mess. And whatever risks there are for the UK, there isn't that set of risks. Fourth risk is deflation risk, the need to gain competitiveness by raising the real value. The need to gain competitiveness by falling prices in euro will raise the real value of Spanish debt, both public and private, to a much greater extent than the IMF thinks. And finally, there are some economic differences. Spain had a larger current account deficit going into the crisis, a bigger investment boom in housing, and so far a somewhat bigger recession. Now, the key point about this, and I won't go through all of them, is almost all of those differences, liquidity risk, credit risk, breakup risk, deflation risk, and I would argue the current account deficit, were directly related to membership of the Eurozone. That is why those risks exist, and without them, they wouldn't be subject to the risk. So the difference is derived from the fact that the UK is a currency area, but Spain is part of one. I.e., the UK is still sovereign in this respect, and Spain is not. And this fact gives the UK at least 3 forms of protection. There's adjustment to the desire to hold UK assets. Obviously, people didn't want to hold as much UK assets after the crisis as before. Will go partly via the price of the currency, not just the prices of bonds. We had a price adjustment on the exchange rate. It was very quick, and I think that was mostly due to the perfectly understandable feeling that the world didn't want to hold as much UK assets as otherwise, and the adjustment of the currency was an incredibly helpful, stabilizing adjustment of that flight, while in the Spanish case, of course, it was a quantity adjustment, i.e. a sudden stop. Let me make it absolutely clear. The sudden stop was the equivalent to the sudden depreciation. Thank God for the currency. Friedman and Keynes were right. The UK is its own safe haven for investors who need currency matches. There are an incredibly large number of investors who need currency matches. They need long-term assets in their own currency because they have liabilities in their own currency. Pension funds are the most important. Insurance companies are another lot. And basically, if you have to hold a hedge in your currency, and you're a British person with British liabilities, you have to hold British government debt. But Spain is competing with a completely different safe haven in the currency area, namely Germany, and it's not an equal competition. If you want a safe haven in euros, you don't stay in Spain. That's pretty obvious. And of course the UK has its own central bank, God bless it. So in brief, the UK remains sovereign and Spain does not. Now the crucial question is, was this a necessary consequence of the Eurozone or contingent? The argument that it was necessary. First, I would remind you why this wasn't some sort of weird accident. The Eurozone was intended, deliberately designed and promoted to promote capital flows. And most participants, and I talked to very senior officials, I will not mention names here, thought that the huge capital flows from Northern Europe to Southern Europe that occurred in the first 10 years of the Eurozone was a signal of its remarkable success. I would insist they thought it was a signal of its remarkable success. Balance of payments imbalances and so the subsequent financial crises were a feature, not a bug. And I had arguments with people about this. I was particularly concerned about Spain in 2006 and 2007, and I could not persuade anybody that at least I spoke to of how big a crisis it could be. Secondly, the Eurozone was also intended to have a goal-independent central bank, and in a multi-currency currency union would, of course, the only alternative would have been controlled by the Eurogroup of finance ministers. So having the sort of central bank that cannot make the sort of commitments the Bank of England can make in the debt markets is a feature, not a bug. It's an inherent feature of the system. So the ECB simply cannot make open-ended and unconditional commitments to support member countries' debt in the worst possible cases, and everybody knows this. Breakup risk, deflation risk and credit risk are again all necessary features of a currency union. They cannot be removed or avoided. They're inherent in the system. The way out of this could only be through creation of a federal sovereign or a vastly greater degree of risk pooling among existing sovereigns. In other words, the creation of a currency union with a federal union, which was precisely what was known to be impossible when the currency union was established, and the hope was that the currency union would lead to such a federal union in a crisis. Now, the contingent points is it's certainly made more difficult by the fact that the core country is, of course, structurally surplus, and in fact a whole range of countries are structurally surplus, and those surpluses are not going to go away in any way, shape or form. And in addition, the core country thinks that counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy is wicked in all and every circumstances, and that they also think that what does not kill you make you stronger. So these are contingent views. One could imagine core countries for a system, for instance the US, which is inherently sloppy and loves running huge current account deficits. I tend to take the Keynesian view, is that's the only way for a hegemon to behave. I've said this many times. I have got absolutely nowhere on that one. So the question that is interesting is, why were proponents largely unaware of the specific dangers I have stressed? And the answer is they thought currency risk was the predominant source of crises. Their analysis of the past history of Europe was that the currency risk was the predominant source of crises. They thought they had eliminated currency risk and therefore crises could not happen. And they were, of course, wrong. Currency risk cannot be eliminated as long as they're countries, unless you can prevent them from acting in a sovereign manner to leave a system. Everybody knows there is currency risk, however well suppressed. Currency risk will re-emerge in other ways, and then it will inflict a great deal of financial and economic pain. QV. So, final chart. So the conclusion I've reached, which is not something I had realized before, I have to say, to the degree that I have, perhaps that was foolish, taking this example, that high-income countries, I've stressed this because of the similarity between them, and they're very different in some ways from emerging countries, embedded inside a currency union are more vulnerable to balance of payments from financial crises than countries with floating exchange rates in their own central banks. The currency union has succeeded in replacing the brief currency crises of the exchange rate mechanism, brief, intense, messy, with long-running solvency, employment and political crises, and I can't see why that's a good switch. It could, of course, be solved by becoming a minimum federal union, one that provided adequate insurance to the member countries, but that will be a very big shift from what they have now, really a massive shift, and it's not, in my view, going to happen, but that's a very big question. And in the end, has this lesson been worth the friction and stress? I really doubt it. Thank you.